The ship is fairly well wrecked. There's been a number of adventures to get to this stage, and this is a kind of calm before the storm with a gradual suspense.
We had this plan that every 6 months we would release a new Dark Picture.
Kind of have a different story and change the mechanics a little bit, and then we realised that's just not enough time.
And we decided every year or so would be a much better cadence. And so we did A Man and Medan, Little Hope, House of Ashes. It's actually probably the most popular of the Dark Pictures. I can distinctly remember sitting with the writers of Until Dawn, Larry and Graham, in New York, talking about space vampires. And then, lo and behold, House of Ashes. Space vampires. Actually, this wasn't going to be a Dark Picture. I'm not going to tell you what it was going to be. It wasn't going to be a Dark Picture. Our original presentation of the first 4 Dark Pictures was Man and Medan, House of Ashes. This was called The Architect, not The Devil in Me, and Directive 8020 were our first 4.
Yeah, when we released Man of Medan here in 2019, I can remember being in one of our meeting rooms, and we had these kind of mock posters put up for all of the first 8 games in the Dark Pictures on the wall. So we could see, okay, we've got the idea for Man of Medan, House of Ashes, The Devil and Me, and then going into what we then called season 2, a whole load of other stories there. So we've had them for years, kind of ahead of time, and the stories change, as they develop. But yeah, we like I say, however long that is, 7-8 years ago, we've had the idea for Directive 8020.
So that was like one of those like original 8 in that batch?
It was, although it changed. It had a really, really interesting kind of past. Like in a very early concept stage, we actually had 2 science fiction games that we were going to make. We had one called Directive 8020 and one called Cassiopeia. And we decided, okay, that's probably too much for the timeline that we wanted to do, so let's merge those stories together. So it became Directive 8020, and that led to some really, really big story changes. And one of the stories originally was written as, okay, this crew is going off to Tau Ceti F, and they're going to go and colonize this planet. But then near the end of the game, there's this big twist where they realize that the ship's actually been sat in a hangar all this time, and it's all a big experiment for them. But we abandoned that story, but we ended up keeping some of the same character names, we kept the planet the same, we kept the ship. But it was around that point that we thought, actually, it would be quite cool to do a sort of homage to John Carpenter's The Thing. So we wanted a real alien presence in there. And then the story really kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, with Directive 8020, there's a lot of changes to the formula, but the formula should feel familiar to players. But typical Supermassive, it plays through, you think you know what's going on, we twist it, and then we really twist it at the end. And it's got a lovely kind of what the at the end of like, oh, it's that. Really?
You gotta bring the nose up!
7 clicks.
We're too far now!
Our games are really, really big on story. We try and make them as kind of cinematic as we can.
Narrative is a key aspect of our DNA.
It's a sort of a bit of a playable movie about a lot of the narrative games we do, but a real sort of special sauce comes in the branching of the games.
The idea of every player will have their own unique playthrough, and they can still talk to each other about it. The different things, hey, in my playthrough, this character lived, but in my friend's playthrough, that character died.
In our games, you control multiple characters, and all of them have to make decisions, and so you're presented with choices on the screen, and some of those decisions lead to the story significantly branching and kind of lead to different endings. So it's that kind of thing especially works really, really well for us in horror, where in horror movies you often find yourself shouting at the screen, kind of going like, no, don't do that, don't do that. And now we give you the chance to actually have that opportunity for yourself and kind of go, well, what would you do in that situation? And it's quite surprising. We often find people do react in a kind of slightly panicked way and make the wrong decision, because in the moment when they're put in that position, it is tough.
The way that we make the Dark Pictures games, we spend a long time on developing it. We have a small team on it in the early phases, in pre-concept and then in concept, where Hannah was really heavily involved in that phase of it, where we, these amazing images of what the monsters and the characters will look like and what the environment will look like.
We start making things pretty, or in our case, horror games, not so pretty.
But then you have to go around in circles lots and lots of times to try and get that story that, you started with a high level brief, and how do you get it to something that's huge?
We learn with every single game that we make new things about narrative and new challenges about the sort of branching narrative genre. It's not easy. We start off, I guess, very, very early on. We use a piece of software which we call a storyboard tool.
That we use not just for the storyboard or the script, but it helps us determine all the logic of the different choices and consequence and which characters are in which scene, when, where and how, which is quite, it's like a big tangle of spaghetti sometimes.
Yeah.
But once you know how to use it, it's so helpful.
Yeah. Especially when you get towards the end and you see you've got all of the branches and the whole thing is just spaghetti.
Yes. But we love spaghetti.
We love it.
And we get narrative designers and writers together and designers to kind of work on helping us map out all of the branching there. And it's tricky because it's bringing together gameplay and storytelling in very, very sort of intense ways. They kind of come together, and to get that sweet spot between them is very, very difficult.
We do a lot of work on the scope that we need the game to be before we start finalising all the branches. So we know which ones, through trial and improvement and iteration and testing and everything, which are the meaningful choices and consequences. And then we just go through writing draft stages, don't we?
And then we have some kind of trackers like within our tool that help us kind of set like where you've made a specific choice and where it's going to play out consequentially like later. So you might have more short-term consequences, you might have much longer-term consequences, but we've got all of that kind of tracked, and we can then pick out like what that specific branch is, what that choice is that you've made, and what are the consequences later down the line. And then we just make sure that all of those kind of hit in some way somewhere along the game.
Every choice needs to matter.
Yeah.
And whether it's a life or death choice, you open a door and you get ripped in half, or if it's a character telling you they've betrayed you, they need to be as impactful as each other in different ways. And so that helps us to figure out which choices really matter, and they're the ones that you'll see in the game.
Do you have like a, let's say, like not necessarily like a preferred path, but like a path that you, like if you were to play it, like how would you like go through it? Like when you're developing the game, do you have like something that you kind of like favor?
That's a very tricky question. So I actually, funny enough, I've worked in branching narratives for quite a long time, and I don't think that's fair. I always think about branching. Every branch is as important as everyone, because that's a story that you play. I as a player will experience one story. You as a player will experience a different story, and it needs to be as valid and as good as mine. So I always try to balance those ones, not only me, but the entire team and the creative director. We put really a lot of emphasis into it is your story. It is your outcome. The people that die on your run is as valid as the ones that die on mine.
Every player needs to be able to get to the end, and every story that they experience along the way with all the different branches or the dead characters or the different endings has to be not just consistent but also satisfying to the player. And so going through all of them to make sure they all work properly that's the real challenge in making this kind of game.
So a lot of the design decisions we make and challenges we come up against are dictated by how do we tell the best story. So, whether that's explicit or implicit narrative through environmental storytelling, through dialogue, through player action, things like that. So it's an important part that feeds into all the decisions we make, all the discussions we have. It's a big part of, the studio's identity, and it seeps into everything we do.
About, I think, we're also making the gameplay and the narrative harmonious, right? Because you can have an amazing story, but if it doesn't fit in with your gameplay, then you're going to have a problem. So we go through a lot of iteration cycles with that, as well as making sure that those two things team up really nicely, and so it's a wonderful story to be part of, but it's also a fun game to play as well.
This ship is infected with an alien organism. For all we know, it could be in our own bloodstreams by now. Directive 8020 states, the Earth must be protected.
I think the unique thing about Directive is that this is now season 2 of the Dark Pictures, and we very much went into this with a mindset of like, we want to elevate this, we want to continue developing the Dark Pictures, and we had more room to just be like flexible and play around and figure out how we wanted to tell this story, not just narratively but through the gameplay as well. And I think that's the biggest thing that's kind of come out of Directive 8020 for sure.
One of the mechanics that we are really quite pleased with is what we call real-time threats, which are sort of monsters that will move around the game world, and you have to kind of avoid them.
There's more on the sticks exploration with consequence. You can die holding the controller rather than die after making a terrible, awful choice.
Put players on their toes a bit more.
You're actually in danger when you're exploring this spaceship.
That's a new thing for us as a studio, never mind just on Dark Pictures, and one of the things we wanted to do was explore this idea of you feeling more tense and scared in exploration, which in other games, because there wasn't threat, it was all implied as opposed to being explicit, and we wanted to be a bit more explicit with it.
That kind of came for me for when I was playing our earlier games. There's a kind of sense that sometimes you're only really in danger in the cinematic sections. You know that when you're walking around on the sticks, that's more for story development and kind of finding clues and building up atmosphere, which is cool. But I really, really wanted there to be danger in those moments as well.
We have some stealth style gameplay. There's no point inventing something as horrible as these hunters and then not using them quite frequently.
Finding what stealth means for Supermassive, it took quite a lot of iterations, and how that then leads into a cinematic that showcases that tense moment, right? So we've gone through a lot of research, and then what we did is iterate a lot into what felt right, what felt the longest time. You know, is it too short? Is it too small? Is the pacing right? So we did work a lot on that.
It's been quite a long process trying to nail down what exactly feels right for the franchise and trying to make it fit with how our games work cinematically and have that same feeling.
But it was a massive change. It meant that we had to kind of, in order to support that sort of stealth-like gameplay, we had to fundamentally change the way the character moves and controls. We had to look at all the 3 Cs and kind of really, really work into it, which ultimately was really, really good because it meant that the whole game feels more kind of tactile now, which is really, really nice.
It just opens us up to new types of play and new types of game, and I think it also opens us up to new types of horror, which is really fun, right? Because I think there's something really special about being in an encounter and having to lean forward. Like, everyone's had that moment when they're playing a game when you have to lean forward and lock in and be like, right, I need to get around this encounter. And so I think adding that in it's just adding new pages into our book, right? It's things that we can keep coming back to. It's new types of scares, it's new types of horror. It amps up the tension because now that character can die at any point. So now there's even more pressure on the player that, right, you've got to get this right, because otherwise your run's ruined, they're all going to die, and you're going to feel really sad about it. And that's what we love, right? We want that to happen. So the more we can put that in, like, the better for us, really.
The other area we looked into is what we call the turning point system.
And we're really glad we put it in for Directive, because we have such a branching storyline and we have so many different paths that you can go down. And I think previously you'd have to start the game again and sort of remember the choices that you made and who did I kill here and who do I want to kill here, and with the turning points it just lays it all out for you. So it's a big narrative map essentially, and so I think it makes it really accessible, and it means that all of the hard work that our devs put into the game, it's so much easier for people to go and find that. It's also really good for like the completionists who want to find every secret, every death, every trophy, you know, all of that kind of fun stuff. It does make that much easier. But obviously we were really aware of our players wanting to keep that original play style as well. So we kept survivor mode in, so you can just turn that off.
If you look back to all of our previous games, including Until Dawn and all of the Dark Pictures games, as soon as you make a choice, we save. We're quite mean like that. You know, as soon as you can't turn your console off quick enough to, you know, you've made that choice and then someone dies in front of you and you've got to live with that. And we still want players to experience that emotion, that sense of loss when they lose a character, or joy when they craft a relationship in a certain way and they get that cool moment between friends or colleagues or whatever. But actually, if you're trying to, Hannah says, trying to play through the first time and keep everyone alive, that can be heartbreaking for you. And so the Turning Points allows you to make that change and rewind it a bit. And I know that people are going to be playing that with in our couch co-op mode where they're playing with their friends. I think it's going to be really good for our players. They're going to get to experience a whole lot more of the game that we make, that we put our hearts and souls into, and I know the rest of the team put their hearts and souls into as well.
So that was really, it was almost like we kind of came at that thinking that we wanted to be a bit more graceful with players' time. I think that's something that a lot of games are doing now. They realise that people don't have all the time in the world, and when they come back and replay it, I want to kind of get to the point where I want to replay as quickly as possible.
Back up now.
Sure, man.
We love working in horror, and we get to work on loads of different subgenres of horror. But yeah, it's that human, relatable characters that you like, or sometimes you don't like, but that we can twist it and then eventually you will like them because of the journey they've been on. That we're scaring the hell out of the players, but also we're trying to make them laugh and we're really trying to make them cry because they care about the characters and what happens to them. And we are horror fans, most of us anyway, so we watch a lot of horror, we play a lot of horror. And then, whilst we're talking about all the fidelity we bring to it and the human stories, there's a lot of gore.
Gore, deaths. We love a death.
Ripping people to shreds and smashing their heads in. And
blood, guts.
The horror and the gore.
I was going to say death.
we go there, I think, is the main thing.
Yeah.
We go there with the horror. Like, we don't fade to black. We really let you see what you have inflicted on that character by causing their demise.
We're a studio. We're a studio of horror fans, aren't we? Taking inspiration from all of our sort of combined love of the genre and finding ways to turn that on its head and I don't know, be inspired.
So we lead that effort. My production team, we lead that effort. We have reviews with all the different disciplines, looking at each shot, how it can be improved, how we can make it a bit more intense, or linger on that moment a bit longer to really bring the emotion out and see the light going out in someone's eyes, or even focusing on the other characters that have just witnessed that horror of that moment.
These stories are like inherently human, right? So there's also something really special about having a narrative-based game and spending as much time as we do writing these narratives so that people can connect with it and people understand these characters are just people. Like, that's something I think really special about Directive is we have a crew full of like scientists. They're just normal people, they're not action heroes. And so I think when you're telling these stories and when you get players to make these choices, there's something really evocative about the fact they are just people and you are telling human stories, which is really lovely.
It's all about the authenticity of the character performance. Is a scene credible when you look at it? Are the characters' actions believable? Is the motivation behind those actions believable? Does it hold up? Probably the key most important thing, I would say.
As a studio, we've been really, really lucky with casting. We've worked with some fantastic actors over the years. With Until Dawn, we had an amazing cast for that, but obviously it's notable that Rami Malek there went on and to great Oscar-winning success after Until Dawn. And then that continued with other games we worked on. Obviously, we had Jessie Buckley in The Devil in Me, who's recently had great success. And then with Directive 8020, we're lucky enough to be working with Lashana Lynch. So she's been absolutely amazing in this, and one of the bigger actors we've worked with. Like when we cast her, we were just blown away that we managed to get hold of her. We always have this kind of thing with all of the games we make, that the scripts that we have are so big because of all the branching. We can't possibly just give that to the actor and say, get off book and all of that. So we give them a kind of sample of it. And then when they arrive on the set, we obviously send them all the scripts. We don't expect them to read all of them. We kind of work through it over the course of the shoot. But it's really, really fun because when they get there, it's a bit of a surprise to them where their character goes as well. And I think Lashana was really, really good. We wanted to cast, we originally started as thinking this is a story which has a cast of characters from around the world all coming together for this big sort of mission for humanity. And we wanted a British star in there, so we wanted a British female star, and it was great to have Lashana there. She brought a brilliant kind of calmness under pressure to the role, that she's really, really kind of on it. But she's also very funny, so there's a kind of sparkle in her eye, and some of the scenes are great with her and the other characters. Yeah, really cool.
Playing as Stafford right now, quite late in the narrative, and this is a really good chance to see all of the goo that's taken over the ship, and also hear some of the icky sounds that we created to just make the player's skin crawl in this area. So something we do at Supermassive is we work really hard to create really believable character sound, because it makes the experience completely so much more immersive. So every surface in the game will have a different tagged footstep type, and there's also some cloth foley. So every movement of the arm, even the neck and the wrist movements are all tracked. They'll all play sound. So whether you're close to them and you've got that sense of intimacy, or whether you're far from them or they're running, you get a real sense of that cloth moving at the same time as they are, and it just draws you into the narrative. So what you're hearing there is a lot of it was pumpkin flesh being torn and kind of recorded at a very high frequency, so that when it pitches down, it pulls those higher frequencies down. It's still got the top end clarity, but it's got a slightly different texture to it. So yeah, that was part of our vegetable destruction recording session for this project. And we used a similar technique for some of the enemies' movement and their foley as well. So we'd have kind of gungy, squishy kind of vegetable recordings, but obviously manipulated, playing back at different volumes, etc., as their arms are moving, for example. As you can hear in game there, the Corinth jingle, the synth sounds that make up the wedge tool puzzle, all the blips and bleeps telemetry, the music you can hear coming now, it's all tuned deliberately to kind of give a sense of unity and kind of calm. And then as soon as the alarm kicks in or the music changes, we can flip it to be discordant to really increase that. The Cassiopeia is in kind of 3 states. Its first state is flying, its second state is crash landed, so we don't get the opportunity to use the same kind of engine rumble sounds, that kind of thing. And then the final state is when it's kind of nearly destroyed here. So when it's flying, it's very easy. We have that kind of low rumble, like being on a jet engined airplane. But after it crashes, it becomes a lot more eerie because obviously the engines are not working. And in fact, we had various parameters that we could change the kind of energy levels of all of the machinery, etc., on the ship to go to a low power state to give it a real sense of kind of slowed down and they're in danger. And then as the ship progresses to be more and more gunged up, we had something called the goo factor, which went from 0 to 100, started somewhere around the kind of first quarter of the game and got up to 100 about 5-6 levels from the end. And this parameter just drove a ton of things. It would increase the volume and frequency of the goo splats. It would change distortion levels. What else did we do with that?
Vents. Change the ambience on the vents based on goo factor.
Yep.
The creepiness came in as well, the screechiness.
The idea being that it was taking over all of the mech on the ship, the fans in the vents. Anything that would move, we would get that sound to change with the goo factor. We're quite focused on what we can do with sound to promote a kind of emotional response. And there's one frequency which we've put in different places in the game. It was a frequency discovered by a number of people. One of them was a scientist working late night. his peripheral vision, he thought he was seeing entities in his peripheral vision. It turned out to be a freshly installed aircon unit, the frame of which was vibrating at this resonant frequency of his eyeball. So we put some frequencies in the game. They're quite low frequencies, so not everyone will get them. You've got to have a pretty good system and probably a sub to get them. But we've also put harmonic frequencies of those in the game, which some people will benefit from. Yeah, hope that enhances the experience, really.
Is that you, Cooper?
Then that brings us kind of bang up to date. Obviously, over here, we've run out of room. There is no more space. We're going to have to start moving over there, I think. We're early doors on Dark Pictures 6. We're starting pre-production on an all-new story, which will take us in the next evolution of our horror games. As I said, this is a much bigger game. This is sort of 8 or 9 hours of game compared with the smaller previous Dark Pictures. And that's also part of it, trying to give more space to our stories.
We kind of really, really want to, I guess we want to become, you know, one of the best in class in dark fiction. So story is at the heart of what we do as a studio. And we're kind of, you know, we're very, very focused on horror. And I myself, I hope we will carry on making, you know, as many horror games as we can. But I think as a studio, we might, you know, broaden our sights slightly. As long as we're in that kind of dark fiction area, there are other genres that we definitely like to explore. The great thing about horror is it's a really, really broad church. You know, there's a whole load of different types of horror movie and loads and loads of different subgenres. And I think because of that, it attracts a really, really diverse audience. And a lot of people find that kind of community in horror. And so our community is amazing. You know, we have a load of people that are really, really, really passionate about the genre. But it allows us to kind of explore different stories that we don't get kind of locked in, and this is one of the great things about the Dark Pictures series, where each of our different games jumps to a different sort of subgenre of horror. So we might be looking at kind of ghosts one day and vampires the next or whatever. So it keeps it fresh within our studio as well, that our teams are able to kind of go, oh, what are we going to work on next? It's going to be very different from the last thing. And that's cool. It's cool for our teams and kind of cool for our audience as well.